we're doing in the next panel is to sort of, in the wake of what was just discussed, sort of how do we work in that context? Like, how do we create, especially university and other kinds of engagements that help to fix and or mitigate the harms created by the legacies of the doctrine of discovery. So let me just do another share and see. I've been working feverishly on all my shares. So I want to reorient sort of a notion around environmental justice that is rooted in um, kind of the wake of the doctrine of discovery and sort of, works against it and to create spaces against it. So I'll talk about sort of these legacies and sort of how water is life, water is sacred, and Penobscot people and places like Standing Rock, how this gets mobilized, and how critically, number two, sort of Wabanaki diplomacy and sort of the connection to collaborative work is so important to these spaces. And I'll look a little bit about and define just sustainability and centering the sacred as these sort of under things that undergird these moves. And I'll try to do my own little reach out in terms of our signage project, in terms of reorienting the work here on our campus. So I know most people on this call remember Standing Rock, and so these are some of the images that are mobilized, sort of water is life, or water is literally a relation, is a critical part of that. In the work that Bridie and Nolan and I have done with Penobscot Nation, Jan Paul is critical to that. She has great quotes and a great framework, as someone who works in the Department of Natural Resources for the Penobscot Nation, but also as a committed Penobscot Nation citizen to our lands, resources, and relations. The river has been ours for a long time, not for ownership, but part of who we are. So this connection of like the river as a relation is critical to this, and so much more. So Cheryl Francis quote there, sort of it's life sustaining, it's recreation, it's culture, it's nutrition, it's our serenity. All these things are a critical frame to understand what we need to do in moving forward. Again, the diplomacy, Wabanaki diplomacies have existed for hundreds, if not of years, if not longer, in this place for addressing these kinds of issues. Multicultural, multinational ways of engaging and managing resources. That has been the critical part of what Wabanaki diplomacy has addressed, both before the arrival and after the arrival of Europeans. Critical to that, everyone talks. It engages a process that is so critical across communities and cultures. And you've seen this enacted here in Penobscot territory. Chelsea mentioned, went into pretty deep analysis of the law case. The law case is just one part of this, right? It's about building relations with each other, whether you are Wabanaki or not, in protecting these lands and resources. And there have been lots of actions, often through the really incredible imaginings and management of Wabanaki women who have really taken on critical roles in the coalition building, and you can think about people like Sherry Mitchell, who's already mentioned, Don Neptune Adams, Maria Gerard, all these great amazing people working to build relations, not just with our non-human relations, but in other human communities. Critical to these movements in sort of imaginaries is what David Schlossberg calls just sustainability. So it's not just do we engage in a resistance to the destruction or taking away of what is rightfully ours, but are we modeling through just sustainability another alternative? So even at Standing Rock and through various forms of food sovereignty and other kinds of movements here with the Wabanaki folks in Maine, this modeling a different way of engaging the resources and having a just sustainable future has been a critical part of these movements. So this really pushes what we would think of as environmental justice movements to a new and I think Indigenous-led imaginary about what is the future of these places. For Colville scholar and author Dina Healy-Whitaker, she talks about Indigenous space and notions of the sacred as critical part of reorienting our environmental justice work, as that paves the way for Indigenous futures, which are against, and she calls these out specifically, against the imperialist roots of federal Indian law and the doctrine of discovery. So how does one begin this work? What does that mean? I'm already at my 5 minutes, but our signage project on campus is meant to reorient your experience to campus. It is meant to connect you to past and present moments. It is meant to make the invisible visible and create relations of place that exist beyond names on a map and the, people who have no longer, naming places after people and not feeling the connection to the past set of relations for that. So obviously there are many signs, and we've put up phase 2 is pretty much completed. So there are now another 10 or 11 signs on campus, and that the purpose of that work will be picked up by both Bridie and Nolan. So I'll hand it over to Bridie.
Okay, thanks, Darren, for that opening. Share my screen here as well. Okay, excellent. So I wanted to start by connecting back with a point that Judith Josiah Martin made in the first session when she emphasized how important and central dialogue is for addressing racism systemically. And we just couldn't agree more. In the work that Darren, Nolan, and I have been doing, dialogue has just been central to the critical questioning, learning, relationship building, and these broader processes of institutional change. And in planning this, we wanted to be able to demonstrate this dialogic approach, but we found that the Zoom format isn't super conducive for doing that. However, this was our intent, and we just wanted to note that's why we approached it as these 3 conversational presentations. So there are multiple origins for the story for how I came to this work, but 2014 was an important moment when 2 specific opportunities emerged. The first was that I was offered a faculty position, and I found myself asking what it meant for me to accept this position at UMaine, on Marsh Island, and in the homelands of the Penobscot Nation. I started asking the question, what does this position mean in terms of my responsibilities and commitments within the Penobscot River? And then the second opportunity was that we received a Track 2 EPSCoR grant to create the Future of Dams project. And this was an outgrowth of 2 previous EPSCoR projects, including the Sustainability Solutions Initiative that launched the Mitchell Center, and a second follow-on Track 2 to create the Safe Beaches and Shellfish project. So when the Future of Dams was funded, Darren and I and several others, David Hart and the Mitchell Center was involved in these early conversations. We wanted to set up a series of dialogues to reflect on what we had learned from these previous EPSCoR projects about what it means to do science within Indigenous homelands. We also focused on how dams are a form of environmental racism, especially in how they disproportionately and negatively affect Indigenous people and cultures. So the Future of Dams expanded ongoing work with partners in the Penobscot Nation's Water Resources Program, building from established partnerships with John Banks and Dan Kuzniers, and where Darren and I started working more closely with Jan Paul, who Darren already mentioned, as well as Angie Reed. So the work with Jan and Angie started as these open-ended discussions, going out on walks together, having dinner together about our shared interests, and then these conversations evolved into collaborative research that focused on the Penobscot River restoration effort that you see here, a service learning project in my environmental communication class that we were calling Removing Our Blinders, and Nolan's co-leadership, along with Tyler Quiring, a PhD student at the time, to create a project called Awikikataso, which the name that we learned from Carol Dana, who's a knowledge keeper in the Penobscot Nation, and it means it was made to write. So this is the name that we use to describe this engaged digital media project to document the Penobscot Nation's water monitoring program. Across these efforts, we identified a number of commitments that have been central in our ability to build capacity for institutional change. We use writing as a process of learning to learn. which has also helped us find ways to center Wabanaki knowledge. So for example, this orientation to learning and Wabanaki knowledge has meant revising my courses to draw extensively from Wabanaki writers, as well as co-designing courses to teach materials that are meaningful to Wabanaki partners. This work has intensified our commitments to interdisciplinarity, recognizing that these binaries between research, teaching, and service, the social sciences and the natural sciences, are products of white Western discourses about knowledge. Interdisciplinarity helps challenge these reductive binaries, and it's another way for us of centering Indigenous approaches to knowledge, which are more holistic. And Sharon Mitchell has a recent article that came out in Orion magazine that really describes this beautifully. Relationships are at the heart of this work, and they change the nature of how we do research and what it means to do ethical research. When relationships are central, then demonstrated listening and reciprocity are commitments that allow us to build those relationships and conduct research in ethical ways. Darren and I have been working with UMaine's IRB to help revise how they review research in support of these kinds of commitments as well. And then finally, disrupting hierarchies of expertise, such as those that exist between faculty and students, supports intergenerational relationship building and enriches our process of mutual learning. And said another way, I think Darren and I have learned as much from Nolan as he has learned from us. And I think, as you'll see in his presentation, this has also really helped foster Nolan's leadership of efforts to decolonize UMaine. So I'll turn it over to him now.
Thanks, Bridie. That creates a really great context of sort of how my story emerged through the Future of Dams project. But before I get into that, I'd like to start off with a quote from Donna Loring that really speaks to my pedagogy of being a Wabanaki educator. And she says that through education comes understanding, and from understanding comes respect. And as Bridie mentioned, sort of my story started through the Future of Dams projects, through reconnecting with my Wabanaki family, through the Wabanaki Youth and Science program, with Bridie and Darren being my teachers and evolving into more of my family members. I started working, as Bridie mentioned, in a collaborative project with the Penobscot Nation's water quality team and the University of Maine. And I really spent time listening to both the river and to the stories of my family who are intimately connected with it. And this is when I really found a passion for applying Indigenous research methodologies, such as storytelling, into projects like these that sort of create an awareness and an understanding and a respect of our ways of being and knowing, and to work towards justice for the sake of the Wabanaki people by continuing the story of my ancestors and the elders by adding a story of my own for those to learn that will come after me. And this brings me to where I am today with you in my story. To start off, just for a general overview of the Wabanaki Studies Law, which is what my work today mainly consists of. The Wabanaki Studies Law, it was passed in 2001, and it consists of two sections. The first section requires all Maine schools to teach Wabanaki government and political systems and how they relate to nation and state levels of political systems, cultural systems, and as well as accurate history. And the second chapter has to do with the establishment and the implementation of a statewide system of learning results. And in response to this chapter, the second one, the Wabanaki Studies Commission was implemented, but unfortunately they quickly dissolved in 2005 after submitting a final report in 2003 that contained recommendations for the state to follow in order to implement the law quickly. And just for more sort of context of the Wabanaki Studies Law, I highly recommend reading any work done by Dr. Rebecca Sockbasin, who is a fellow Wabanaki scholar, policymaker, and mother from the Penobscot Penobscot community. And she quotes that, as Wabanaki people, we hoped the Wabanaki Studies Law would begin to critically address our people's racist experiences. But in need to do that and for implementation, there is many barriers that need to be broken down in order to create a framework for decolonization in institutional spaces. First and foremost, obviously the reinstatement of the Wabanaki Studies Commission, which of course would need funding for, and also funding for professional development opportunities for the teachers that are already graduated and in the field. A compulsory course at all College of Education and Human Development schools in Maine in order to properly train teachers to teach according to the law. And then, of course, a change in teacher certification requirements, given that teachers are mandated to have specific requirements in order to go out into the field, but none of that has to do with complying to the law of the Wabanaki Studies Law. And just for current context of the action that is being taken, there is a lot of work being done by both non-native and native communities working together. However, external support and assistance is required, such as from these decision makers and key stakeholders within institutional spaces. And this brings me to speak about the university's role in reinforcing settler colonialism, starting off from the doctrine of discovery. Sort of the state and university systems are in a well position to assist in breaking down these barriers that I mentioned, given the context of the recent ban of Native American mascots. And as Darren talked about, the signage project at the University of Maine. So they're in a very well position to assist in breaking down these barriers that the commission are asked to do in 2003. But however, until such action is taken, this concern for decolonization and a statewide human rights issue will remain. And what universities really need to do is hold up a mirror and see how that they are benefiting from these colonial paradigms and hegemonic power structures that continue to tell the stories and the benefit of the victorious. In the process of removing barriers of the implementation to the Wabanaki Studies Law can holistically, in a sense, change this dominant narrative, starting back from the doctrine of discovery, and set these examples for not just spaces in university, but all spaces of knowledge production across time, space, and disciplines. And to end off, I want to use this quote. I think it beautifully encapsulates the sort of unique work that is going on here in the state of Maine, and the reason why we're even here today. It comes from Sandy Whitehawk from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. First, for context, the name Wapanaki means the people of the dawn, and Wapanakik is in Wabanaki territory. And in regard to this, she quotes, "Of course it starts in Maine, the people of the dawn, the people of the first light. That is where everything begins."